there are many sort of exciting, dramatic moments in incidents in the life of a slave girl. A lot of suspense, a lot of fear, and she writes it very well. Where we are not sure what is going to happen, we are not sure what is to come, and it has a drama to it. Of course, uh, because the story was being written from the position of somebody actually writing their story, it was clear that she made it, so to speak. Um, yet, yet, one of the things that she writes very vividly about, and she actually interjects with philosophical questions and thoughtful questions about the implications on her life. Um, that in moments are quite bold. One of the key moments in the work, which tells us a lot, helps us to begin to think about what the slave narrative was about and what its intention was. And remember, one of the things I said about the slave narrative is that the slave narrative was fundamentally um, co-opted and used um, to bring about the abolition of slavery. It was an instrument and a tool for the abolition of slavery because, of course, the slave narrative was predicated on the notion that somebody had to tell the story as it really was, and had to tell the counter story to the propaganda that had been passed along about how happy slaves were and how good the life of the slave was. In fact, before Harriet Jacobs started writing Incidents, she had written a letter after she read one of the ex-president's wife describing the happiness and the ease with which her enslaved workers in the White House were very sort of loyal and so on and so forth. And Jacobs was so annoyed by this that she wrote a letter that was published in the newspapers, challenging this notion and trying to explain that if an enslaved person expressed what we might call loyalty or a peace of mind and so on and so forth, it was because of the fear of retribution if they did otherwise. And in a sense, its boldness and its willingness to challenge the status quo, um, I think, emboldened Harriet Jacobs to decide to write her own Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl. So here's the moment that I wanted to just center on. In the moment when she's telling the story of her decision to allow herself to become the lover, the concubine of this plantation owner, this slaveholder Sawyer, who was a benevolent figure, but he was certainly a much older man, um, and he was willing to sleep with Harriet Jacobs, to the extent that for an extended period, so that she had two children by him. Um, she writes about it, and she's very embarrassed by this telling. She's embarrassed by it because, of course, she was not married, and she had used this opportunity as a way to ward off the advances that she did not want, the very aggressive and very violent advances of her owner. And in a sense, she felt compromised and she felt it was a problem. But one of the interesting things is when she tells that story, she starts to address her reader. And her readership, it becomes clear when she addresses them as dear women. She says, dear ladies who are living in the north in your little homes and so on and so forth, you may read this and and want to judge me and want to question my integrity and want to question who I am and so on and so forth. But I beg you, indulge me just to understand that when you're a slave, it may help you to a moment to understand how our rights are taken away as slaves, how all sense of moral fortitude and so on and so forth are deprived of us because of slavery. And if you could just for a moment imagine what it takes for a woman, she said, to do this, to choose to do this as a way to protect herself, then you'll understand. And it was a very telling moment because, of course, what Harriet Jacobs was doing was she was making it clear that the target audience for this work was white women. And one can be really, really clear about who these women were. These were women who also Frederick Douglass targeted and was very interested in, because Frederick Douglass did a lot of speaking engagements. He did parlor talks and so on and so forth. And he became deeply associated with the suffragette movement for the right to vote for women, the amelioration of women, and he became a very big advocate for that. And part of the strategic reason that these women were being approached, especially women who lived in the North, and especially women whose husbands were people who owned property, owned some kind of business connection to slavery. They themselves may not have owned slaves, but they certainly had investments in an interest in the slave trade, because it was one of the most lucrative forms of income, period, in America. There was a time in the 1800s when cotton was the biggest earner of money, by far, by even over anything else. And therefore, even though these men may not have been literal owners of slaves, they certainly were investors in the slave trade, and investors in the slave economy and the plantation system. And so the goal was that if we could convince the wives about the inhumanity of it, these wives will then try to get their husbands to divest themselves of that interest, and through this act of divestment, it would reduce the lucrative nature of the slave driven economy, and therefore could play a big part in the bringing down of the slave trade and so on. So consequently, the women became very much targeted, to be convinced of the abhorrence of slavery. And in many of the abolitionist societies throughout the North, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Pennsylvania, Providence, all of these places were places in which women were leading the anti-slavery movement and were the advocates, and were actually challenging their very husbands about in being invested in the slave movement. So this is one of the more telling moments in the work, and it tells you a lot about how Harriet Jacobs was also quite calculated in the way that she wrote the work. I mean, I just want you to understand that these writers were writing explicitly with an audience in mind, an explicit kind of audience in mind, and therefore it affected what they wrote. They didn't have to. They certainly had to explain a lot of things about their lives, because that material about their life was not known to these white people. If they're writing for their own people who know their life, it may have been a different thing. But the rhetorical purpose of the slave narrative was to convince. The rhetorical purpose of the slave narrative was to lead to action. There's another interesting moment in the work in which Harriet Jacobs demonstrates the extent to which what she was doing was dangerous, and what she was doing by writing about her life as an escaped slave. What she was doing by writing about that life was essentially putting on the page the mechanisms by which enslaved people found their freedom. This was a danger. And Harriet Jacobs, in her own book, her own autobiography, in Incidents, she explicitly says, I will not tell you all the details by which I managed to find my freedom. I will not tell you the route I took, because these routes were what we'd call the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad was a secret railroad, because if anybody who were involved in the recapturing of slaves knew what the safe houses were, knew what the routes were, they would lay wait and they would recapture the slaves. So Harriet Jacobs knew that she had to either falsify the information about the route that she took and the mechanisms that she used, or or not mention them at all. And this is one of the moments when you're reading the work and you go, okay, this is real, as we say. This is a very serious situation. The other thing is that she also hinted that her capacity to write played a major role in her ability to get out, get free. If you imagine an enslaved person trying to escape, typically somebody of her complexion, that is somebody who's light skinned and so on, would claim to be, when faced with questioning white people on the roads and so on and so forth as she's going, would claim to be free. But then the question would be, well, where are your papers? Um, and she forged her freedom papers. That's what she did. She wrote on paper, and the freedom papers, of course, were handwritten, as most of the documents at the time would have been. So she forged her freedom papers, and therefore, she being literate, they would not expect this black woman to be literate to be able to forge it. And so she got through many very tight situations because she had these papers, and that indicated that she was a free woman, which were completely forged because they weren't. And so, one of the things I wanted to point to is that there is a sense in which these stories, these narratives, are very, very careful about helping us understand the context and the nature of slavery and the things that people had to do to escape slavery and to avoid slavery. The story of Harriet Jacobs is that she gets away from slavery and then she tries her best to reunite her children. Fortunately, Sawyer, the man that she slept with, who was the father of her children, lived up to his promise that he would, because the danger was that her owner had said if she doesn't sleep with him, he would sell her children to different parts of the world, right? Different owners and so on and so forth, to split them up, because he knew this would be punishing to her. And he threatened her, essentially blackmailing her that if she did not sleep with him, this is what he would do. Well, she had disappeared, so he figured she had escaped. And so this is what he chose to do. So he met with a trader, a slave trader, an agent, and he instructed the agent to sell the children to different owners and so on. But it turns out that the slave agent was somebody who was also being paid by Sawyer, and Sawyer had told him that he would purchase the two children from him, and so he purchased and kept those children together. Eventually, Harriet Jacob would be able to have her children together in the North when they eventually became free, and when she was able to purchase her own freedom. As I tell these stories of the enslaved people, um, I'm speaking about all of this with a certain kind of alacrity and I mean, one could call it enthusiasm and so on and so forth. But I hope it's clear that this is a tragically sad accounting of what a nation had been doing and how it existed and how it functioned. The legacy of slavery is one that continues to this day, and it continues because it became endemic to the society, became a part of the society and the way that the society understood itself. The slave trade and the slave system forced African Americans to find paths towards their own self-dignity, their own self-worth, and their own place in the American society. The idea that slavery took place so long ago is a little ridiculous because, of course, it wasn't that long ago. It's just a matter of a few generations. And it's in those generations, the legacy of that enslavement still lives as a palpable and tragic truth for the society, because for the period in which enslaved people were enslaved, they had absolutely no capacity to make wealth. They had absolutely no capacity to build families and build cultures. And those that managed to do so did so against all odds. But what they eventually were able to do was to tell the story. And one of the things that we are doing in this course is looking at the story, the telling of the story. And in the process of telling the story, there's this wonderful, enriching sense of sublimation and beauty, the dignity of the telling of the story. Harriet Jacob, Alauda Equiano, Frederick Douglass, great voices in the articulation of humanity and the articulation of the African in America. So that would be the end of our lectures for this week. In terms of Harriet Jacob, I think one of the things that you can consider when you're writing about it is who is the audience and why is the audience as it is in the work of Harriet Jacob, and how does she indicate who she's talking to and how that how is that affected. And the other question to think about is why Harriet Jacob would have decided to write her narrative and to tell this story. And finally, I think a key question is considering what the life of an enslaved woman would have been like. The life of an enslaved woman was one in which her body was owned by somebody else and could be used and abused to the service of white society. Many of you may know of the story of Mims, the doctor who is often called the father of gynecology, and that's a viciously dangerous kind of appellation, because of course all the lessons that he learned, everything that he learned about the woman's reproductive organs and the woman's reproduction and her body were learned through violent and vicious experimentations with enslaved women, black women in the South. And he was doing these experiments to be able to then have the knowledge and have the capacity to treat white women. That's the cost. The enslaved people had no rights, and they were treated in this way to benefit white society. It is a emblematic moment, and of course, it's one that is historically documented. So I think I will end there. Thank you very much. See you next week.